All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Research Bites. My name is Audrey Catalano. I'm the program coordinator here at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. The monthly Research Bites series is one of many programs that we've initiated to engage scholars, students, staff, and community members in interdisciplinary scholarship and programming around the topics of race and ethnicity. Thank you to Tierra, our center's program administrator, for thinking up and bringing to life this series. And thank you to Taylor Pate and Ndidi Opara, our multimedia and marketing assistants, for their work behind the scenes. Our goal for this series is to connect staff from across the university with faculty affiliates of the center who study, teach, and write about race and ethnicity. We wanted to create an informal and interactive space where staff can learn firsthand about some of the exciting research happening on campus, and to provide an opportunity for faculty and staff to network and with hope that we will find some shared interests and possibilities for future collaborations. You can subscribe to our Research Bites and CSRPC listservs to be notified of future conversations. The first 25 staff members to register for Research Bites events will receive a $20 Grubhub credit to buy lunch on us. Congratulations to those who are enjoying their lunches right now. So today we are joined by a very special guest, postdoctoral researcher at the rank of instructor, Maya Singhal. Maya Singhal is a postdoctoral researcher and instructor in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. They received their PhD in anthropology from Harvard University. Maya's work is broadly about how people navigate violence across generations. Their current book project is an ethnographic and historical study of community defense and its challenges for African American and Chinese American populations, primarily in Lower Manhattan from the 1960s to the present. Please give a warm welcome to our friend, faculty member, Maya Singhal.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for that introduction, and to CSRPC for inviting me to speak. And of course, thank you so much to Tierra for organizing this. I want this to be kind of informal, so I'll try to talk more briefly and leave room for questions, and we can have a conversation. I also don't have visuals because as an anthropologist, I feel sometimes nervous around sharing people's intimate parts of their lives visually, although I'll tell you stories, I guess. So we can also talk about the discipline too. The current research that I'm working on is a project I'm calling Safer Black and Chinese Community Defense in Lower Manhattan. And this work came out of research that I did for my dissertation during the pandemic. In my dissertation research, I was specifically interested in Black and Chinese collaborations in New York City around practices that I'll call extra legal or maybe a little less than legal. Originally, before the pandemic hit, I'd been really curious about references I'd seen in various newspaper archives to Black and Chinese collaborations in heroin trades, primarily going to New York that boomed after the Vietnam War. However, I'm an anthropologist and more specifically a social anthropologist, and that means that there's a disciplinary expectation that I do some form of ethnographic field work. So I go to some place and work with groups or a group of people. So I actually started this field work when the pandemic began, which was a little tricky. But sort of during the connected moments, I'll say, in 2020 of the pandemic, of Black Lives Matter protests, of Stop Asian Hate protests, I both had to sort of change how I was thinking about doing research to be pandemic safe. So a lot of this work happens outside and is somewhat less formal than a lot of the groups that you might imagine anthropologists studying. But it also gave me the opportunity to see a growing movement of people who are trying to build Black and Asian solidarity out of these very sort of urgent and growing grounded concerns for safety from both legal and extra-legal racist violence. So part of my research was on things like the debates around the replacement of jails on Rikers Island with new jails that are planned to be built in every borough except Staten Island, including a jail that'll be in Manhattan's Chinatown. And part of my work there was around both the Black and Chinese and Italian and Dominican uh, collaborations and solidarities that were built as people were protesting the construction of these new jails, um, but also a lot of the concern about Rikers has led to people supporting almost any alternative plan to Rikers Island. And so from a lot of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people and their families, there's also sort of pushback against protests against jail building because they feel that sort of building alternatives to Rikers Island is the only way that we can build safety for our communities. So I think part of my work in general is about the uneven tensions and the kinds of varied interracial solidarities and also antagonisms that come out of these concerns about community safety, about policing, and about prisons. So another thing, though, that really struck me when I was doing my dissertation research was that in response to the rise in anti-Asian violence during the pandemic, there was a lot of people who developed community-free self-defense classes in Chinatown, and at many of these classes, Black and Asian solidarity was proposed as a tool for community safety. In fact, it was a sort of very important, consistent narrative at a lot of these classes. Um, and a lot of sort of we imagine, I think when I say Chinatown, we can imagine this very, very Asian space. But actually, these classes were attended by people of all races, and there were a lot of African American martial artists and boxers who had seen anti-Asian violence on the news or had heard about it from their friends and community members. And so they came to Chinatown to try to, draw from their expertise and help people learn how to defend themselves. Um, and I thought that this was a sort of fascinating moment. Meanwhile, like in the media, on the news, I think you often saw um, that the news was highlighting attacks of particularly African American men or non-Asian minorities attacking older Asian people and specifically older Asian women a lot of the time. And those were sort of prevailing narratives about what threat looked like to Asian communities. So in part, there was also a concern um, that these narratives required new forms of Black and Asian solidarity to kind of protect both of our communities from these like street attacks. Um, but there's actually sort of another iteration of the call for Black and Asian solidarity in the face of anti-Asian violence that I think comes more from police and prison abolitionist organizers. And this is that a lot of them have asked for Asian Americans specifically in this moment concerned about their community's safety to work to develop methods for community defense that don't rely on calling for increased policing and increased police budgets in order because um, increasing police endangers Black people in these communities. So in order to protect Black people in New York, abolitionists are calling for Asian Americans to rethink what community safety might look like instead of having more police around. But this has led to a lot of different kinds of solutions and a lot of different kinds um, of patrols and community defense efforts, which is the focus of my research. And I think not all of them, even when they're not explicitly police, um, not all of them sort of fit into what we might imagine an abolitionist framework can be. And so that's part of what I'm interested in. My research is kind of fascinated by the call for Black and Asian solidarity in the face of violence. I want to understand what we make of claims that Black and Asian solidarity can keep us safe. Um, And how do we understand these claims historically? So as I think about the different ways that our communities are currently working to keep each other safe, part of this research project I'm thinking about now is thinking about the longer histories of community defense. So right now at U Chicago, I'm teaching a class called Violence, Vigilantism, Community Defense, and Armed Resistance, which is in the RDI department. And we're thinking about examples like Robert Williams' NAACP chapter that armed itself against the KKK in North Carolina, I think, or the Black Panthers, who are famous for armed resistance against police violence, but whose practices for community defense also included a variety of forms of community support, like free food programs, among other things, among a lot of other things. Um, but just other ways that we wouldn't necessarily think of when we imagine the term community defense. Um, and then in New York specifically, Black and Brown neighborhoods have developed all kinds of strategies for community support and defense. And, some of these include neighborhood patrols, and other forms of sort of like communal policing or um, sort of communal safety efforts, self-defense classes, things like that, but also sort of other forms of community care and support that comes out of building trust with your neighbors and building trust with the other people in your community to help each other manage, the all of the things that we experience living in such close proximity to each other in a city like New York. Although I think very similar things are true of Chicago too. One of the most famous patrols you guys might have heard of is the Guardian Angels, which was formed, I think, in the 70s, and was primarily made up of Black and Brown young people, although it was founded by a, I think, Polish person who actually ran for New York mayor a few years ago when Eric Adams won as a Republican. Um, but the Guardian Angels patrols, I mean, they worked in the 70s, they were working to patrol the subway system to try to keep people safe from various kinds of subway attacks and subway crime. And today patrols, they have sort of branches of the Guardian Angels all over the country, I think all over the world actually, and they still patrol today. They were actually kind of a feature of Chinatown during the pandemic, but they had these red berets and stuff. You might have seen them. Um, but yeah, they also sort of took up this concern about anti-Asian violence in Chinatown and crime there. Um, but the Guardian Angels is a sort of interesting example because even as they're sort of, Black and brown kids and they're criminalized by the state in various ways for doing this community policing work or community patrolling work. They also get called in when business owners are trying to clean up Times Square. They get called in to sort of try to scare like homeless people and things out of the neighborhood to try to like clean up the neighborhood. So they get sort of brought into all of these really carceral and kind of conservative um, safety projects alongside, the other kinds of work and the other kinds of state criminalization of them that are happening. Um, so I think part of the question of community patrols is that as we think about what it means to keep each other safe, we have to think about who we're trying to keep each other safe from. So do we see our communities or other marginalized people as threats, or do we see them as part of a group of us who are under threat from the state, the police, but also who are under threat from like the conditions of our sort of the impoverishment of our communities and sort of other forms that are imposed upon these communities in our spaces. Um, so one of the things that I'm really interested and that's really important to me in my work is that I'm not necessarily working with people with the most radical politics. So I know I was talking about abolition earlier, um, but I think, you know, part of what makes it hard to do abolitionist organizing is that some of us can get kind of removed from these like pragmatic safety concerns that people have in their day-to-day lives. A lot of the people, both Black and Chinese people that I work with, are not necessarily anti-police. They see the value of having someone to call um, when, things go awry. However, I think most of these communities acknowledge that the police are extremely inadequate with dealing with violence. They just don't necessarily see other options. So I think as what I'm interested in from a sort of abolitionist perspective is that I think it's important that we think seriously about these concerns about safety and that we think through different efforts and the different ways that our communities have and continue to innovate ways to help keep each other actually safe and address these sort of pressing concerns about immediate violence. Um, in the absence of police, so we can make a stronger argument for, uh, for abolition. I know I have a few more minutes, so maybe I'll also say a little bit about what brought me to this research, because I think it's obviously, for me, it was a very um, organic concern that came up. I started doing work with these self-defense classes because I saw them everywhere and I was intrigued, and it was some way that I could do research and it was still relatively pandemic safe because it was outdoors and we could wear masks and things like that. Um, but I think I've also been interested in the relationship between Black and Asian communities. It's kind of how I came into the field of Asian American studies. When I went to college, I started college sort of at the tail end of the 2014 Black Lives Matter um, protests. And so I think always Asian American studies for me and my training was based around Black studies, and it was based um, in the kind of third world solidarity history, which is the origins of the field of ethnic studies anyway. Um, so when I moved, I grew up in California and I moved to New York in 2014. And I wanted to do American studies and Asian American studies. But what I found was that like there is no Asian American studies without this theoretical foundation of Black studies. And similarly, I felt that a lot of people's training in Black studies can be very focused on the specific relation, like on Black communities in the US specifically, but also on specific relationships between anti-Blackness and white supremacy. But I think there's something really important when we start thinking about the ways that race is developed and the ways that racism has come to affect a variety of different racial groups through questions of xenophobia and like labor that come out through different kinds of immigration histories and different histories of sort of solidarity and sort of capitulation to state and all of these different issues. So for me, in part, this research is something I've been thinking about for a much longer time, I think, because um, the foundation of how I imagine Asian America has always been kind of about the ways that Asian American actually was like the term Asian American comes out of student organizing, and it comes out of a political organizing moment. Um, so it's also it's inadequate to kind of the term Asian American doesn't quite help us easily think about our racial experiences because obviously well I'm actually half Indian and half Chinese, and I think a lot of people will say, oh, you don't look Chinese. And there's something interesting about this racial moment and how we make certain kinds of racial identifications um like within Asian communities that can make the idea of Asianness really challenging for us to grapple with. Um, And so for me, thinking about Asian American as first and foremost a political tool to help us think about solidarities between people who are racialized quite differently, is also about sort of Black and Asian solidarities. It's also about all of these other kinds of connections and the work that our solidarities do in helping us stay safe and get free. So maybe I'll stop there and ask if there are questions.
If you guys don't want to come off Zoom, feel free to drop it in the chat if you have a question. Or you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Either way, it's fine.
Hi, so I'm curious, and I want to make sure I heard you correctly when you talked about the youth that actually go out to scare, quote unquote, the homeless
Mm.
that are out on the street. Has any research or what happens to these individuals? Has any research been done, I guess, because I'm totally startled by it, but has any research been done like these, what's going on in these people's lives 5, 10 years after they have had to do this?
Um, oh, so the research about what happens to the guardian angels um after they're sort of working in Times Square, is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. I don't know about the individuals because I think a lot more well, a very public focus. The founder of the Guardian Angels is Curtis Sliwa.
Hmm.
Who, like I said, he was a Republican candidate for mayor a few years back in New
Hmm.
And so there's been much more focus on him because he was sort of like very anti-vaccination during the pandemic. And, he was sort of still pushing a lot of these like, um, support for the NYPD and this kind of politics. The other interesting thing about him though, so I actually, when I go back to New York, where I've lived for the last several years, is the Chinatown in Brooklyn called Sunset Park, which is actually a Mexican and Chinese neighborhood. And it's also that area is, I think it's the most conservative district in New York. And so I think it's interesting. It's like a lot of Asians, a lot of Latino, and it's a lot of like new immigrants. It's actually a neighborhood that I find a little hard to navigate without speaking. Well, I speak a little Spanish and I speak a little Cantonese and Mandarin. So it's, I can get by, but um it's also still, so I think the point I want to make when I say this is just to say that it is like a very new group of immigrants, but it's interesting um, that these are groups that are voting really conservatively. But the thing that I think Curtis Sliwa shows us is he was actually one of the only mayoral candidates who came down to Sunset Park to campaign and to talk to these people and to think about their concerns and what they were worried about for their communities. So I think I'm not sure about the other members because they tend to be a little more sort of anonymous. And I think there's a way that we can have history tends to favor the like founders and the big men. And also like this man runs for mayor, so he creates a paper trail. Um, and I would actually be really curious. And it's something that I'm hoping to I would love to track down people and see where they're at and if they, what their reflections are of this moment, because that's, I mean, I can't imagine what it would have been like. So I'm really curious to know. So yeah, thank you for that question. But yeah, I think thinking through how the sort of the carceral politics of this group kind of moves us into this like conservative mayoral run is really interesting too.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. I'm seeing a question in the chat. Should I read it out? I don't know.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. I'm curious about the major themes concerning hindrances of solidarity among social groups you work with, and how do we see the discourse and practice around this changing in light of various political dynamics and social movement work? Yeah, I mean, I think one of the sort of questions I get asked a lot is, it seems like, um, there's all these kinds of ways where Asians are like imagined to be a model minority and therefore pitted against Black and Latino communities, um, or that like Asians tend to favor like law and order politics, or like I was saying, right, like a lot of the newer immigrants tend to vote conservative, and we can think about reasons why that are not necessarily sort of a support for normative law and order, but like pragmatic concerns about people like coming into their neighborhood and like beating them up and like, taking their wages. So I think like the hindrances to solidarity is something I've been really interested in, because as I'm asking about moments, particularly in the sort of 70s and 80s, I start hearing stories about the widespread like mugging and different kinds of violence that people were experiencing that made them feel really like concerned about outsiders in their communities and people that they didn't know. And sometimes this was a concern about sort of interracial differences. I mean, um, there's a lot of people who've written about like there was a lot of sort of gang conflicts and gang violence in Chinatown amongst Chinese gangs, and different kinds of like Chinatown political battles were played out through these gangs. And so there's also a concern about different kinds of Chinese ethnic groups. So when we think about interracial solidarities or antagonisms, we can often think about, well, it's sort of racial group split, but there's also all of these, right, like different kinds of ways that our communities are split from each other and have political differences and ethnic differences, and the vying for power and control of a neighborhood and for money when there's not that much, right? Like these are all ways that things get split. And I'm interested in how people start working to overcome them. And sometimes it's like the state does come in and they're like, we need to stop, like we're cracking down on like gang violence. And sometimes that in some ways for some amount of time stops it. It's just that then we get a group of people who like go to prison and come out with a variety of, right, like different kinds of relationships and solutions and relationships to their community and to the state. And sometimes it can like radicalize people, and sometimes it serves as sort of an entrenchment of, like people learn how to drug deal and do various things like while they're incarcerated, and that comes back into sort of histories of these communities as well. So I think like there's no easy answers is what I want to say. I think part of the interesting thing about doing ethnographic research here is that we really see that sort of solidarities and divisions between communities don't happen along these easy lines, but actually there's so much complication. And that also, we can appeal to different things for different communities to try to bring them together. So I think like one of the things I've been thinking about with abolition is that I think we're getting out organized by a lot of the conservatives because they identify the fact that people are genuinely concerned about safety in their communities. And when they hear the only thing from sort of liberals or leftists that, we don't want extra police, they are not sure about what else we want, right? And so trying to speak to people's like lived experiences and their real concerns, um, and take seriously what's going on in their lives and in their spaces, what histories of violence they faced and how we can kind of like work together to build support systems and to build community trust and to like a lot of these self-defense classes, people are also just like meet each other, get to know your community, get to know other people who came here to be in this space. And so there's also these like sort of little ways that people I think are trying to develop these kinds of relationships. So I guess the annoying and academic answer is it's complicated, right? Another question.
I have a question.
Oh yeah,
Oh, I
go
was
ahead.
going to try to jump in.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to ask a question about, thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. I'm interested in this course that you're teaching, and I wanted to hear more about your experience in the classroom teaching the content that you're teaching about, armed resistance, armed self-defense, historically and in the present time, but also like, what is it like teaching in this context of, genocide in Gaza? Like, how do current events come into the classroom? How do you manage that? Like, how have students been responding to the content that you're teaching?
I mean, I think I have actually a pretty big class. I have like 25 students. So, I mean, there's a range of ways that people come to this research. A lot of my students are really, really concerned about sort of the rise of white vigilantism, and that's something that we talk about in this class too. And thinking about sort of the ways that uh like white citizens get kind of like deputized at various historical moments into like state projects of racial control and policing and adjudicating like alleged crimes, right? Um, and I think that this is something that's like very, very current, right? We see questions about vigilantes and things a lot now, and the question of like what violence is legal or extra legal. Um, I mean, I don't know who's in the audience, so I don't want to alarm anyone, but I'll say, the students are very, I think as a whole, familiar with the idea of armed resistance. And I think a lot of people are coming from this from the context of former colonies that won their freedom. And sort of like one of the things we've been talking about is really about what is self-defense and what is community defense, and like to what extent are we justified, and who will the state protect if they, if they sort of use violence to defend themselves and their communities. So in some ways, I think we take this kind of pragmatically because a lot of us come from communities and come from contexts where we can't, right? We either don't want to or can't rely on the police, and where we are faced with some forms of like pressing issues of extra legal or even legal violence. And so I think there's a way that I think these histories are taken up as we can weigh different approaches. Different people had different limits for what they felt was acceptable. Different people trained in different ways. And we also see how the state responded, and we think about, right, like, the Black Panthers would go around with guns to make sure that the police knew that they couldn't just do whatever they wanted. But these days, I think the police are much more likely to shoot first. And so we have to think about like violence in a different way, and we have to rethink our strategies sometimes. So in a way, I think this is very pragmatic, and students see the current moment and see the question of violence as urgent, and we have to think about it in a way that's not theoretical at all, but is sort of a material and urgent reality for ourselves and our communities. There's a question in the chat, says you talked about youth, and your mention of the model minority reminded me of Stacey J. Lee's Unraveling the Model Minority Stereotype, listening to Asian American youth, which discusses the friction of the development of this identity while being American/in America and Asian. She touched briefly on race relations and how those are fostered in the schools. With that, have you delved into how the new generation's view of these relations are being shaped in school, or at least at home? It's interesting. I think so. One thing is, when you do human subject research, so when I like sort of go and talk to real people about their like current lives, institutions are very reluctant to give you access to kids because there's all kinds of like questions about to what extent they can consent to research. So I am trying to less talk to, although I guess youth can be construed broadly, but I think I've sort of, I'm not speaking to students who would be like in like K through 12 school, but a lot of the people, most of the people I work with are young people. I think in New York, there can be a very different way that people relate to each other because it's so easy to get from neighborhood to neighborhood. I'm always struck by how segregated Chicago is. And New York, the subway makes everything so easy and the access between neighborhoods so easy. So I think like a lot of the people that I've talked to about their relationships with other groups and, you know, why sort of non-Asian people come to Chinatown, it's because they've always been in those spaces and they always come there and they build friendships there and they have you know, it's easy to hang out there. Things are cheap. I think there's also like a really big Asian culture wave right now that is bringing people into Asian neighborhoods in ways that sort of foster like affinities and friendships and things in interesting ways, right? When we think about people's like obsession with like K-pop or manga or anime and stuff like that. And so I hear that come up a lot for sure. I don't know if that's about school or if that's about sort of online life, or if that's about sort of the spatial configuration of the city of New York. But I think people, at least people that I talk to, feel that these are like easy and like regular connections that they've been building. So I think that's part of it. I don't know if that really answers your question. I'll say also, one of the things that I thought was interesting coming out of the pandemic moment and the movement for Black Lives was also all of these different Asian language tools for talking to elders in your community and your parents and grandparents about racism. So I think there's also this kind of moment of like intergenerational connection where people are trying to build with like sort of care and concern for your elders, but also trying to figure out how to develop the like native language skills to like explain complicated concepts and to try to like build a sense of like political connectedness through like intergenerational discussion and language learning and things like that. So I thought that was kind of interesting too.
Okay, does anybody have any other questions for Maya? Okay, well, thank you so much for your talk today. We're so grateful to have had you as a Research Bites speaker, and we will end it there.
Well, thank you so much for having me.